Good morning, everyone. This is John Shaw, the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. Thank you for joining a special event in which I'm going to have a conversation with former Governor Jim Edgar, in which we are going to talk about an award that we're working on and launching together. Let me tell you a few words about Governor Edgar. You probably know an awful lot about him. I mean, he's been one of the most respected and successful Illinois politicians in recent memory. The governor is a graduate of Eastern Illinois University, has done about everything. He's been a legislative aide. He's been a member of the Illinois House. He's been an aide in the governor's office. He's been Secretary of State for 10 years. He was a two-term governor, probably could have stayed as long as he wanted had he chosen to. He declined to run for the Senate in 2004, and I heard President Obama once say in an interview that he thought it was one of the good fortunes of his career that Governor Edgar did not have an eye on the seat that President Obama ended up winning. Governor Edgar, after leaving the governor's mansion in Springfield, has had a lot of projects going on, including at the University of Illinois, where he has been instrumental in creating the Edgar Fellows Program, which we're going to talk about in just a couple of minutes. I should say Governor Edgar has been hugely important to the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute. He was here in 1995 with then Senator Paul Simon, launching the Institute, announcing it, has been very supportive over the years. He even somewhat grudgingly gave Paul one of his deputies, Mike Lawrence, to come to Carbondale and help start the Institute. And then Mike, of course, later served as director. So Governor Edgar has been a hugely important figure. He's come here on a number of occasions, including on our 20th anniversary, to give a keynote address. I'll say just on a personal level, the governor, I've been in touch with him a number of times over the last couple of years to talk about Institute projects and things we might do together. And he always ends the conversation by saying, how can I help you? In what way can I help advance the Institute? So Governor, thank you so much for being here.
Good to be with you.
Well, Governor, we could talk about your political career for a long, long time. You've done so many interesting things, but I want to touch on a couple things that I think kind of illuminate the award that we are going to be launching. And I want to go first to maybe one of your first jobs. I think it was your first job. You left Eastern. You were a legislative intern in Springfield, and you worked for Senator Arrington, Russell Arrington. And it's interesting because he's someone that maybe is not well known now, but I've heard both you and Senator Durbin say he is one of these really quietly consequential figures in Illinois history. So tell us a little bit about what it was like to start out with Senator Arrington, what it was like to be there in '69 when so many really consequential things were happening in Springfield.
Well, first of all, I would not say that he was quiet at his time. He was he was a short gentleman, but he made up for that with a lot of get up and go. He did not suffer fools well. And it was my really struck a luck that I got assigned to be an intern with him in late 1968 and 69. And I got the job to sit next to him on the Senate floor. I kept a binder that had staff comments on every piece of legislation. And Senator Arrington he developed staffing in the Illinois legislature. Along with Abner Mikva, they created the internship program. And then he was a big proponent of bringing in professional staffing into the legislature. And but that was a great opportunity to see a lot of things that we're still dealing with today. I mean, he was the sponsor of the original income tax, created the Department of Transportation, Department of Law Enforcement. All those things happened in that session in 1969 in about 15 minutes. Because they had a deal. That's back when, and that's how I thought the process worked. You know, you'd argue and argue, but at the end of the session, Republicans and Democrats would sit down and they would compromise and they would solve the problems. And so that was a great session to start my career. The only thing that kind of spoiled me, it made me believe that state government was always going to solve the problems. And that was Arrington's goal. He told me one time, we're not here for politics. We're here to solve problems. And if he didn't solve a problem, he was very upset. And I remember a few times he'd be upset. But also at that time, when Senator Arrington was in his height of power, the lieutenant governor still presided over the state Senate. And in 1969, the presiding officer, the lieutenant governor, was Paul Simon. And that's when I first met Paul. And he had come from the state Senate before he was elected.
In terms of Arrington, I think you had once said that even though he was a moderate to conservative Republican, you once called him one of the most progressive people in the General Assembly. And by that, I think you meant just this kind of approach to solving problems. He did not like to do politics and play politics. He understood how the game worked, but he also was very insistent on getting results.
He definitely was a problem solver. I mean, and he's the person that sponsored the gun owner identification card in Illinois. We're the first place in the country that had something like that. Think of that today. A Republican wouldn't get within 100 miles of that piece of legislation today. But Arrington thought there was a problem and needed to be solved. My most famous, I guess, dealings with Senator Arrington was after he failed to get a gasoline tax increase for mass transportation that Governor Ogilvie wanted. And was very upset, just very upset. And I remember telling him, I said, "Oh, Senator, if you'd have kept pushing your members," because they controlled the Senate, Republicans controlled the Senate at that time. I said, "they might have revolted and thrown you out as leader." And that's when he told me that quote that I told, I think, every time I've ever gave a talk, "Jim, we're not here to play politics. We're here to solve problems," and we didn't solve the problem. And that stuck with me. But that was Arrington. He was a problem solver, and he was an innovator. Income tax, classic example. Before he became Senate Republican leader, he'd been chairman of the Senate Revenue Committee, I think, for 10 years. And he always said there'd be an income tax over his dead body. Well, Ogilvie comes in as governor, state's in bad financial shape. We're one of the few states that did not have an income tax at that time. And Ogilvie asked Arrington to sponsor the income tax because the state needed it. And Arrington, to his credit, recognized the state needed it. Now, he was physically sick for about a week after he agreed to be the sponsor, but he knew it had to be done. And he got it passed. And later on, he always said that was probably the most important thing he did in his time in the General Assembly, was to get the income tax passed. So here's a person who had strong feelings, but he also could see when he had to change, and he had to do things that he really didn't want to do, but it was in the best interest for the state. And so again, Arrington was a great mentor. And my philosophy in government really comes from those years I worked with Senator Arrington and watched how he operated. And he was very good at reaching across the aisle. When he had to, he would go across the aisle. In fact, there was a couple of times he tried to sneak open housing through. Here's again another thing. Here's this conservative from the suburbs. He was trying to get open housing passed back in the late 60s, and only 2 of his members agreed with him. And the rest were just furious. But Arrington thought that needed to be done.
Well, Governor, let's talk about your time as Secretary of State, because you were there for a decade. We think of the Secretary of State's office as sort of a sleepy office that can be a political stepping stone. But I think of your time there and just the consequential things that happened. I mean, you guys modernized securities law in Illinois. You passed a whole new regime of DUI legislation, instituted, mandatory auto insurance, very aggressive on the literacy front, help launch and build a state library. Tell us about your approach there. I mean, you could have just kind of played it easy and just enjoyed it and gone around the state cutting ribbons, but you did some big consequential things from an office that we don't always think of as being consequential.
Well, I'd been appointed, and I hadn't been elected. Nobody knew who I was. I was 34 years old, from Charleston, Illinois. Jim Thompson had named me. I'd been his aide in the legislature, but nobody knew me. I knew I was going to have a tough time getting the nomination in my own party, probably, and then getting elected. So I knew I had to kind of hit the ground running. I couldn't just, rely on my name being on the front door of the Secretary of State's office and everybody's billfold on their driver's license. So I had to, be active. And one of the big problems at that time, now today people would find this hard to believe. Nobody took drunk driving serious back then. In Illinois, they had tried to strengthen the laws and couldn't get on first base. And I remember I decided I wanted to do that first thing. And I had a lot of people say, well, that's suicide. You know, you're not going to get that done. You're just going to make people mad. Well, it turned out people began to realize how serious it was. And, you know, we got that done that first year. And that really kind of set the stage for me as Secretary of State. Now, probably the most, and that turned out not to be controversial. I mean, I had a few drunks mad at me and a few tavern owners. In fact, when I ran for governor, they would give a 6-pack of Budweiser to anybody to bring in 10 of my yard signs. But for most people, they agreed with that. We convinced them that was when MAD was created, and it turned out to be good timing, which is always important in government. Probably the toughest bill I had to pass, the one that I look back on and I thought is pretty close to being suicidal. We did not require senior citizens to be retested to get driver's license back then. And we had a couple occasions when a 70, 80-year-old would pile into a bunch of people and kill them, drive it. And it's obvious they shouldn't have had a driver's license. So I did propose and got passed right before I ran for governor, a bill that required seniors to be retested. Now I mention this because I'm now approaching that age and I'm going to have to be retested. And I'm just thinking, who is that crazy Secretary of State? But that to me was extremely important for traffic safety, extremely controversial with seniors, but we got it done. So Secretary of State was a fun office because you had all kinds of things. You're the state librarian. So that got me into literacy. It got me into promoting libraries, which I enjoyed very much. Security laws, corporation, all those things are part of the Secretary of State. Now, what's unique about Illinois, Secretary of State has nothing to do with elections, where in most states, that's all they do. But in Illinois, since we have the motor vehicle matters, it's the largest Secretary of State office in the nation. In fact, it's probably as large as all the others combined. So it does give you a great opportunity if you want to do something, to do things. We have the archives. And I remember I sent a note back to Eastern. I was a history major. And I said, this is 20 years since I graduated, but you can now tell them I found a place in my major field. You know, I got a job that corresponded with my degree. So it's an office you can just take it easy, play a lot of golf, or you can do a lot of fun things. People don't usually get mad at you as Secretary of State, not like they do as governor.
Well, when you were here a couple of years ago in 2017 for our 20th anniversary, in your talk, you reflected on your years as governor, and you said running for governor was the hardest thing you've ever done. Tell us what it's like to run for governor of Illinois and how you work through all the various regional differences and partisan differences. Reflect on those campaigns.
Well, to understand, politics in Illinois is a blood sport. I mean, it's not easy. And Secretary of State's pretty easy. I mean, people, as I said, they don't get mad at you. You can do favors, give them a license plate, you know, whatever. And so that was kind of, as I look back on those races, those were very easy. Governor, everything is for keeps. And it's hard on the family. My kids went to high school in Chatham, which is a suburb of Springfield. And nobody ever got on them when I was Secretary of State. Of course, they didn't want to make them mad. I may not give them their driver's license. But when I ran for governor, just running for governor, my kids started hearing things at school. I mean, there's a lot of pressure when you run for governor. This state is very diverse. I'm a downstater. I knew I had to sell myself not only to Chicago, but also to the suburbs where there's more potential Republican votes. And it is a 28-hour-a-day job running for governor. I remember had a press conference early on when I became a candidate, and we had something was in the Secretary of State's office, but it didn't amount to much. And we got done with the press conference, that formal part of it, and I just started talking with the reporters as I always did. And some way we got on to taxes and funding schools. And I said, well, you know, I think we rely on the property tax way too much. And, you know, we really ought to, you know, I think the income tax would be a better way to go. And I've said that many times. Again, the veteran reporters there, they knew this was just chit chat and this wasn't anything they were going to write about. There was a new reporter for the Chicago Tribune there. And the next day in the headline of the Chicago Tribune, Edgar proposes another tax increase. And, you know, needless to say, I caught a lot of flack from members of my party and my staff. And it made me realize, okay, you're running for governor. This is the big time. You don't just say anything that comes to your mind. You've got to think through, and you've got to remember this office is so powerful. The office of governor is one of the most, in Illinois, is one of the most powerful governor's office in the nation. And so the governor is really important, a lot more important than Secretary of State or Attorney General or anything else, or Speaker of the House even, contrary to what some people might think. The governor is still more important than Mike Madigan. So it's a tough go. And I was running against the Attorney General, who was a very popular guy. We'd had a Republican governor for 14 years, and Illinoisans have a tendency, they want to go back and forth. They don't want to stick with this, at least back then, the same party all the time. So, and I'm a downstater anyway, and I've got to convince suburbanites to vote for me in big numbers and hopefully not have Chicagoans just destroy me. But I'd been Secretary of State. And I think the fact that I'd been Secretary of State for 10 years, had been active as Secretary of State, had initiated a lot of programs, got a lot of people to work with me who weren't normal Republicans. I had every, I think, librarian in the state for me when I ran for governor because of my time as state librarian, and most of them were all Democrats. I mean, county chairman used to say to me, how'd you get all those women are here? They're all Democrats when I'd have a rally or something in a town. I said, well, they're connected to the library. So that helped. Just a lot of things broke right for me in that election, but I was worn out. I think that's when I started having heart problems, and because it was a tough race. We didn't know till the next morning that I had won. In fact, the polls had me, well, it was nip and tuck, but the last I was behind a little bit. But I think the Republicans, we did a better job of getting our votes out. Also, I surprised people. I got 25% of the African-American vote in Chicago, and that was a huge amount of vote for a Republican to get in Illinois. So all those things kind of paid off, but it was a tough go and wore out the family. And then after the election, we get to be governor, and the state was broke. I had a Democratic legislature, so it was as bad as running. But I think maybe I'd already been prepared a little bit by going through that campaign.
Well, that's actually where we want to go next. About when you were down here a couple of years ago, you were talking about the role of governor, and you said probably the central thing they have to do is on the budget front, to present and implement a balanced budget. And everything else kind of flows from that central reality. And when you walked in, the budget was out of balance, a lot of unpaid bills. And in the course of your 2 terms, you left your successor with a very healthy surplus. And you kind of did it the old-fashioned way of additional revenues, spending cuts, yet at the same time investing in higher education, early childhood programs. Tell us how you kind of put together a fiscal policy. I think you earned the nickname Governor No, didn't you, for some of your spending cuts?
Well, when I was running for office, I didn't think about I was going to be a fiscal conservative. I mean, I was always a moderate Republican. I just never thought too much about the budget part. I did have to take a position in that campaign, and this is why it was a tough race too. We had a temporary income tax that Mike Madigan had passed 2 years before. He loves temporary tax increases, and it expired my first year. And that was money that went to education and local government. Now, I thought local government was a lot better off than we were at the state level, but schools, I knew we couldn't cut schools and we didn't have any money. We had, when I walked in as governor, the largest budget deficit we'd ever had at that point. Now that looks minor compared to today, but we also had to deal with that temporary tax. And I'd campaign on saying, I'm going to make it permanent. And again, I had all my fellow Republicans just up in arms, but I said, hey, we can't get along without it. And I'm not going to tell people one thing before the election and do something else. That's suicide. And I did say, though, we're not going to raise taxes. Now, we're going to make that temporary tax permanent, but that's as far as I'm going to go. So when I came in and saw how bad the state was, which I really didn't appreciate just how bad it was until during the transition, we figured it out. That's why a transition is a very important, you get the information. We're not here to talk about national things, but that's why it's important that President-elect Biden's team gets information, because fortunately we had that information early in the transition. So on day one, we knew that the budget was going to be our number one priority. We hadn't talked a lot about that in the campaign. How do you deal with a budget crisis? But that became the central theme of my administration for 8 years, was dealing with the budget. And we did cut spending. We did say no a lot. And then eventually we kind of worked, and we had a recession that hit that aggravated it. But we began to work our way out of it and be able to do things like in higher education. First 2 years I was governor, I wasn't real popular on higher education campuses in Illinois, because I actually had cut their budgets. Elementary and secondary got held constant. They didn't get an increase, they didn't get cut, but we did cut higher education. When we finally got money toward the end, then we gave higher education some pretty good increases. And fortunately, they remember that more than they remember. But when I went over to the U of I after I left the governor's office to work there, some of them reminded me that they had gone with a pay cut when I was first governor. So, but those are things we had to do. And people are pretty good out there if you're candid with them up front. And as I explained it to people, I said, it's like your own budget. You know, if you don't have the money, you got to cut out vacations. You can't buy the kids maybe a new bicycle. There's just things you can't do. And they understood that, as long as they thought you were being fair and everybody was being treated equal. It's when you get in trouble is when you, first of all, say everything's okay before the election. Then, oh, I didn't realize how bad things were after the election. Then they don't trust you. Then if you just cut certain things, and everybody didn't feel some of the pain. And so one of the things we realized, we had to cut everybody. Now, we made priorities. I did not want to cut aid to dependent children. I thought that was very important. But we had to cut other welfare programs extra amount, so we had the money not to cut aid to dependent children. So you had to make those calls, and those are tough, because you're making a choice on what's a priority. And to some people, whatever you cut is a priority. And so you had to work through that, but you had to be candid with folks, and you had to be constant. You couldn't, change your mind every day. You had to kind of stick with it. And first 4 months I was governor, everybody was on my case, even the Republicans. Nobody wanted those cuts. And I can remember I was speaking to a group of actuaries. No, they were members of boards of credit unions in Chicago. I just remember it was all a bunch of white men with suits, dark suits. And I'm giving my pitch about, we don't have the money. It's like in your own budget. If you don't have it, you can't spend it. You got to balance the budget, and it's tough. And I went through all this, and I'd given this speech in Springfield, and nobody bought it. They just all were. I get done with this group of businessmen, and they give me a standing ovation. And then I realized the average person understands this. Unfortunately, the politicians who are getting pressured by special interest groups, which I understand, that's who they're hearing from. But the average guy on the street understands you can't spend money you don't have. And that became the theme. And throughout my 8 years, my number one priority was to get a good budget passed. And in the end, about every year, I got the budget the way I wanted. I didn't get other things often, because to me, the priority was the budget. And so when we left office, we'd left $1.5 billion in the treasury. It never happened before, hadn't happened since. I think it took them about 3 months to spend it after I left. But I think we demonstrated you can, manage. Now, I'll have to say, today, it's in far worse shape than anything I had to deal with back in the 90s. And it's going to take a long time to dig out of this hole. And particularly after the tax amendment got defeated, that made the hole even bigger. It also did not create an environment that's going to make it easy to come up with new tax increases, probably in the near future. So it's going to be a huge challenge for the governor. And the governor is the person responsible. If the governor doesn't do the budget, nobody's going to do the budget. It's not in the nature of the legislature to cut and balance a budget. They want to spend. They got constituents. They want to take care of them. The governor is the person who has to lead. If the governor doesn't lead on the budget, it won't get done. Mike Madigan told me one time, he said, I'll follow you, but I'm following you. I'm not leading. On this thing, you've got to lead. And I said, fine, I'll lead. And he was pretty good most of the time on following me and backing me up on when we were trying to balance the budget.
Well, Governor, let's talk a little bit about your relationship with Paul Simon. Paul was I think he was 18 years older than you, so kind of a political generation before you, but I mean, you got a great early start in politics. And I think during most of your time as governor, Senator Simon was the Illinois senator in Washington. Tell us about how your relationship with him, both on a personal level and professional. How did you interact? What was your connection?
Well, I first met him, as I said, right after I went to Springfield as an intern, and he had just been elected lieutenant governor. Met him, and we talked for 5 minutes. And 3 years later, when he was running for Congress down in Southern Illinois, he ran into my father-in-law who lived in Anna. And of course, my father-in-law had to tell him, well, my son-in-law works in Springfield. It's Jim Edgar. He works for Senator Arrington. And Paul, I know Jim. He's a fine young man. He's got a great future. He's really a good guy. Well, now my father-in-law had told me right before he met Paul, he'd never win down there because he's a carpetbagger, because he didn't come from there. He moved down from Troy. And I said, not only is he going to win, I bet you end up voting for him. Well, after he met him, he always voted for him. He didn't agree with anything he did, but he just liked him. I think because he said nice things about his son-in-law. So, but I didn't really know Paul that closely. In fact, when he ran for the Senate in 1984, he ran against Charles Percy. Well, I chaired Percy's campaign. I had just been reelected Secretary of State and led the ticket, so they thought I'd help hold the Republicans in. And so I chaired his campaign. And, I was all for Percy, and I was scared to death Paul was going to run. At one time, he said he wasn't going to run for the Senate. I said, great, because I thought he'd be the toughest person for Percy to run against, and he did. And I knew that was going to be a very tough campaign. And I think it was about midnight, election night, before we knew who had won. But I can remember Senator Percy getting on the phone to call, as soon as he realized he wasn't going to win, to call Paul Simon. And it was a tough campaign. Those are two of the, I said at that point, that's one of the few times I know in Illinois politics, in a way, it didn't matter who won. Either one was going to be a good senator. It wasn't often we had a choice of two really good, decent men running against each other. But I remember Percy got on the phone to him and just couldn't have been nicer to him, ask about the kids. I mean, and I realized, Percy had this reputation of being aloof, but he wasn't. He was a gentleman. And I could tell from the other side of that conversation, Paul Simon was too. And so Paul goes to the U.S. Senate, and, I'd worked against him. But when I became governor, he called me up and he says, Jim, he says, you're the governor. And he says, I think you and I probably have more in common. He says, maybe, Alan Dixon and Jim Thompson, they'd go out and have a beer, but you and I won't do that. He says, we can go out and have a Pepsi. And I said, that's right. And so he was always, whenever I needed something as governor, he was involved in, I could call him. And sometimes he wasn't real sure, but usually he would go along because I was the governor and I needed help. But when we really got to be, I think, closer was when he was deciding not to run. He didn't run for the Senate again. And he was thinking about they were talking about doing the thing at SIU. And Ted Sanders was the president of SIU, who had been the former superintendent of education, who had introduced me when I ran for governor. I mean, we were good friends. So he said, can you come down and help us launch this? I said, sure, I think it's a great idea. And I think it's great for Paul to do this. And went down and visited with Paul. And that's when we began to really develop a close relationship. In 1998, when my term was going to be up, it was actually 97, I had to decide, do I run for re-election or do I run for the Senate? Carol Moseley Brown was up for re-election, and people wanted me to run for the Senate. And I remember Senator Simon, he said, now I can't support you if you run, but I think you ought to really think about running for the Senate. That's a great job. It was interesting talking to him, and our wives got to know each other then. And so from that point on, when he was at the Institute, we worked together when I was governor. Then later, when I went to the Institute in Champaign, we continued to work together. And he'd have me down. I remember he had me down when Walter Cronkite came. That was a big deal for me because, I grew up watching Walter Cronkite. I believed everything he said. And Brenda and I went down, and he really was more interested in talking to Brenda because Brenda was from Anna. And one of his early girlfriends was from Anna. And he was later in life, and he was, I think, remembering those years before. And so he wanted to talk to Brenda about Anna. But Paul would always have me down, and he even tried to get me to come and work at the Institute. And Brenda, she didn't think she really wanted to move back down to Southern Illinois. But he was a good person. He was just, I didn't necessarily agree with everything on his political philosophy, but I always knew that he was going to do what he thought was right. There were times he did things that wasn't your typical Democrat, but he believed it, like on a balanced budget. There were things that he would do, but he was a very innovative guy. I mean, he was always writing a book. I said, "Where do you find time to write books all the time?" But like he was in the water, the problem, the shortage of water. I remember because I was governor, and I had him come to talk to the Midwest governors about water supply because he had written that book, and he was just a gentleman, but also a person who was always thinking down the road. I mean, he could foresee the problems of the future better than anybody I knew. And we shared the same cardiologist. In fact, I visited him about 2 days before he passed away in surgery, and just never dreamed that he would leave us. In fact, he was on the phone. He had just endorsed Obama for the Senate. That was right when Obama was getting ready to run for the Senate, and he was on the phone, and I saw his doctor, and I said, "Yeah, Paul's in there. He's on the phone." He says, "Yeah, I told him to take it easy," and he's just in there, like he's out running like he always was. So he was that way right up to the end.
Well, let's talk for a second about the Edgar Fellows program, because I think that is one of the hallmarks of your post-governor time. Tell us a bit about the program. It began, I think, in 2012. You have over 300 some alums. Seems like a healthy chunk of the General Assembly, a lot of Illinois mayors. Tell us about the idea and the program.
Well, U of I was after me to create something, and I think they just wanted me to raise money, but I didn't, and they wanted ethics, and I really didn't want to deal with ethics. I was tired of hearing about ethics. But what struck me, that the problem in Springfield, then and still today, but definitely then, there was just no dealing between the parties. There was no, as we did back in the 80s and the 90s, sit down and compromise. And people, the two parties were very polarized, which is unfortunate. That's happened today in American politics, more at the national level, but even in Springfield. And so it made it difficult when people didn't know each other and they were always arguing to sit down and compromise. And so I had to do a speech someplace, and I was trying to think, I want to hit on that theme, and I came up with 3 things, 3 C's: civility, compromise, and compassion. And that I realized civility and compromise, those are just things we just don't see enough of, and we got to get people together. And my experience had been in Springfield when I first went there, they'd argue during the day, but they'd go out and socialize at night. And that created a bond that allowed them to finally compromise, because they knew each other and they liked each other. They didn't always agree, but they knew each other and they'd socialize together. And so my thought was to try to identify who are some of the up and comers, both Republicans and Democrats, both from Chicago and downstate, the suburbs, and get them over to Champaign, spend a week together. And we'd talk some issues. We'd have people come in and talk about budgeting and the education, but more importantly, just get them to know each other and to find out that, hey, I'm from downstate and this person's from Chicago, but we got a lot more in common than we have in differences. And that, after you get to know them, it makes it a lot easier to work together and to solve problems. And so we didn't know how this would work for sure, but I'm a stickler on seating arrangements. I believe that's one of the most important things in government is seating arrangements. And I think it's unfortunate we have Republicans on one side of the aisle and Democrats on the other side of the aisle. When I was a legislator in committee, I used to always go sit by the Democrats just to get to know them, because that was the only chance I had to sit by them and get to know them. And so when the fellows first came, the first class of 30, and we had legislators, we had a few local officials, some people from not-for-profits, represented the state pretty well. We had so many African Americans, so many Hispanics, so many from Chicago, the suburbs downstate. It reflected pretty closely the state population and the way people live in Illinois in different areas. So, but we didn't know if it'd work. And so I sat him and I said, okay, every time you sit down twice a day, you're going to sit at a different seat and you're going to sit by somebody different. And I started him off with a question. Tell your person to your right, what's your favorite book? Just something to break the ice. And maybe what's your favorite pet, or where do you like to vacation? So nothing to do really with government, but just about you as a person. Anyway, I think the first year we only met for 3.5 days, and or 2.5 days. But they couldn't go anyplace. They were stuck there. We had them in the hotel there. At night, they would go out to the bar and sit around and talk. By the end of the week, we went around and said, what worked? And they said, that goofy seating arrangement of yours. Says, we know everybody. Said, we thought that was foolish, but we also got a chance we talked some issues with each other, because at the end of each session, we have them just talk among themselves about what they just heard. And they say, we really feel like we know each other. Well, from that first class, we had people who went back to Springfield, Republicans and Democrats, and all of a sudden they started working together. Or if a person from the House went over to the Senate, a Democrat from the House went to the Senate, they knew a Republican senator. They didn't know any senators before, but now they knew a Republican senator. So we saw very quickly this worked. Now, did that cause all the polarization to go away and all the rifts to end? No, because most of these were still rank and file. They're working their way up in the process. Many of them now are committee chairman or they're in leadership. Someday, I said, I hope from this program that we'll have the mayor of Chicago and the governor of Illinois of two different parties who met at the Edgar Fellows and know how to work together. Or just maybe the two leaders in the legislature. And we think this approach helps. Now, a lot of people thought, boy, this is great when we announced it. And I said, don't get excited. This isn't going to solve the state's problems overnight. But I think it has helped people in policy-making positions to get to know each other better and to know personally each other and to be able to find common ground. To me, that's the key in a democracy. You've got to find common ground. And you've got to have civility. You've got to you respect each other, even if you don't agree. And I think this has helped. Now, some of them have moved on. We have one in Congress, and I think that's kind of a waste to send somebody off to Congress. But, we have seen, and some of these people have moved up. Kim Fox, she commented after her week at the Edgar Fellows, she decided she could run for office. She didn't think she could before. She was an aide, but she ran, got elected. And we've had others do that. So it, I think, has worked well. They don't always get along, but for the most part they do. And for the most part, we can point out a lot of accomplishments. One of my favorites is the school aid formula. The Republicans and Democrats working on that. Many of those had met at the Edgar Fellows. And while they argued, they always knew they had to sit down and finally get a resolution to that problem, which is probably the toughest thing in the state government to do, is come up with a school aid formula, because that's winners and losers. That's moving money around, and that's a tough thing to do. And they were successful. I didn't think they would be able to get it done, but I like to think that part of that was because they got to know each other as Edgar Fellows.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the award that we're announcing today, the establishment of it. And it's, we even kind of joked about what to actually call it. Being a little political, I said, hey, let's call it the Jim Edgar Paul Simon Award. You say, no, I'm the junior partner in this relationship. But we will call it the Paul Simon Jim Edgar Prairie State.
Let's just call it the Simon Edgar. These long titles get worded.
Well, that's what on the plaque we'll have Simon Edgar, but we need a longer title for fundraising purposes, perhaps. So, but let me talk for a minute about how I think it came together and just kind of get you to sort of play off it, which is actually I met you many, many years ago. I was an intern in Springfield, first class of Governor's Fellows, and my first rotation was through Governor Thompson's legislative office, and you were then the director of it. So I remember the first day you took me out to lunch at a little restaurant in Springfield. But But then you moved on to some great things. I moved to Washington. And then when I came back in 2018, we got back in touch and talked a lot about the various projects we're involved in. And I was struck by just the Edgar program, the Edgar Fellows program, and particularly the use of statesmanship in so many of your materials. And just, it seemed to me that your animating mission is to take these really rising stars and help move them into the direction of statesmanship. And the Institute has a similar program called Restoring American Statesmanship. And we have an advisory committee, which you are serving on, as well as Senator Lugar, who unfortunately passed, and Lee Hamilton, and Jan Eliasson, a Swedish diplomat. But Governor, let's reflect on that. Just the notion that an award that would look at exemplary service in state and local government in Illinois and kind of honor the best traditions of both parties. You know, neither party has a monopoly on truth or good government, but the best traditions of both parties are pretty good. I mean, and I think both you and Senator Simon reflect those. So if you could say a few words about what you think this award could do and how it might be able to make a modest improvement in the state of Illinois.
But first, let me just say I was very flattered when you asked me to be on the award with Paul Simon. And definitely I need to be second on that. But you know, there's a lot of good people in government in elected office, and it's hard to run for office. In fact, I jokingly say I don't think anybody should be governor or president that hasn't lost an election, because you know, anybody that goes through the electoral process has to really sacrifice to that, because it's not easy, not just running for governor, running for anything. So I think we sell short a lot of the people in elected office. We've got a lot of good Republicans and Democrats in Illinois, both at the state and local level, who are doing a good job. And I think it's important that we recognize that outstanding service, because people often just hear about those who fail or those who get in trouble or those who they disagree with. And most of the issues, both at the state and local level, are not partisan issues. They shouldn't be partisan issues. And so, and I can tell by dealing with the Edgar Fellows, there are some really bright people out there. And I listen to them talk about what they're doing, and they're working together on some issues, or they're working on issues that there's no way you can find a liberal or conservative bent to that. So I think it would be very important that we recognize those people. And so the public knows that there's some really good people there. And also, one of the things that I think is good about this, talking about having, we announce it at the Edgar Fellows, so these up and comers can see some of these who can serve as mentors to them or examples. People who did the tough thing, not the easy thing. Not always maybe in the short term, the popular thing, but what they thought needed to be done. And as I said, I think there's many out there who are trying to do that, and we ought to encourage them and we ought to recognize them. So I'm very excited about this award. I hope it's something that elected officials will hope that someday they might receive, because I think it is an indication that they've done a good job. And again, we just need more elected officials doing a good job, and we need the public to know when elected officials do a good job.
And as I think you and I have discussed, you know, we are not trying to seek and identify perfection. That's not what statesmanship is, but it is people who have a career that is focused on being effective, of doing hard things, and particularly of looking to the long term and not just trying to get by the next election, but just build something that has long-term implications for the state. And I think that there are people like that. And I think you and I have discussed that sometimes when we think of statesmanship, we think of it all happening on the global stage, Nelson Mandela or Gorbachev. But a lot of it is just in the communities where people are doing hard things, putting their careers at risk, but trying to build better communities.
You know, you're talking about we shouldn't look for perfection. One of my heroes is Winston Churchill. And there was someone who thought outside the box, was in the wilderness for many years of his career, but persevered. But he was far from being perfect. I mean, his personality could be a little grating on people, and do things. So again, you're right. And I think sometimes we think people are either very good or they're very bad. My experience has been most of them, particularly go into public life, most everyone wants to do some good. Sometimes they get strayed on the wrong track, but you know, but you're right. We're not going to have perfection, but there are, it amazes me at all levels, the people who are really putting a lot of time and effort to solve problems that really maybe that affect them personally, but they know it's a problem and they want to see a solution. And they put the time and effort, and sometimes they make people mad. Fortunately, we have a lot of elected officials, or let me say not a lot, unfortunately. We have some who will put their political career on the line because they think it's the right thing to do. I think of 3-4 years ago, those 8 Republican legislators in the House who broke party ranks and got the wrath of their governor to vote for a budget that we hadn't had in 3 years. Those are the kind of things to me that I think happen that a lot of people don't know about in government that are crucial. And again, I think it's very important that we recognize those achievements and those profiles and courage. I always talk about we have a lack of profile and courage sometimes in public life today, and we need to be sure we recognize those who do show that courage.
I'll just tell our listeners that we will put more of the facts, the kind of the factual base of this award on both the Institute's website and I'm sure Governor Edgar would be willing to do it on the Edgar Fellows website, so people have a sense of just the mechanics of the award and how it works. Well, Governor, final question. We have one of the wise men of Illinois politics with us, so we can't let this moment be wasted without asking you to give us a kind of big picture assessment of where we're at now. I mean, you mentioned it briefly. We have a governor who's halfway through his first term. His sort of major initiative to restore the state's fiscal position, the Fair Tax Amendment failed. Where do things stand now, both on the budget front, the battle on the pandemic? Where does Illinois look right now as 2020 winds down?
Well, we used to say being governor in the 90s was the best job in American politics. I think being a governor, particularly of a large state like Illinois, in 2020 has got to be the toughest job in American politics. And Governor Pritzker has a huge, huge challenge ahead. I mean, I really feel for him. I went through, I thought, some real problems in the 90s. As I said, they look like child play compared to what he's faced with. We have a huge budget issue. When this tax, whether you're for it or not, when it went down, it created a huge hole that made the fiscal hole for Illinois even deeper. And there are going to have to be some serious cuts. I don't know if the legislature will have the courage to raise revenues after that defeat. I mean, I got to say that if you can't pass a tax that's going to tax the 3% wealthiest in the state, it's going to be hard to get something done. It's going to take a lot of courage if there is tax increase. It's going to take courage to make the cuts, because we're not just talking about cutting somebody else's program. I mean, there's only about 3 areas where you got any money: education, healthcare, and public safety. And nobody's going to want to cut those, but if you don't cut those, you can't really begin to make up this deficit without a tax increase, and a pretty good tax increase. Now, perhaps with President-elect Biden, there's a better opportunity that the federal government might step in and help, as I think everyone thought would happen. But you can't count on that. And even if they do, my dog is getting carried away here. Abe, hey, sorry, shouldn't shut the door. Anyway, I lost my track. My problem is my dog. I don't have to worry about the budget. Is dealing with the budget. But you put that on top of the pandemic. That's just a huge, huge problem. And if you didn't have the budget problem, how do you deal with that? How does that, you deal with it and not destroy our economy, but at the same time, you've got to save lives? So there's probably never been a time in my memory that Illinois state government faces a greater challenge than it does going into 2021. And it's going to take some really tough decisions. It's going to take some good planning, and it's going to take courage on the part of our elected officials, not just the governor. The governor can't do it alone. And it's going to have to, both parties need to be involved in this, because my experience, you can't really do tough things without people from both parties being involved. Sometimes you can ram things through by one party, but this is going to be so massive and so difficult. I don't think you can just count on one party to come up with the votes. So hopefully everybody will put this election behind them and not worry so much about the election in 2 years, which is hard to do. And also, this is a redistricting year, which is something that's number one on the minds of all legislators. But put all that aside and deal with the problems, because as I said, this is the greatest challenge I think Illinois government has ever faced. And it's going to take people working together, people, swallowing some things they don't like, but trying to do what has to be done to get this state on track and to make sure we have a bright future. Because if we don't, it's going to be decades, not just a few years, before we get out of this mess if we don't deal with it quickly.
Great. Well, Governor, thank you so much. I know you have a busy week. In fact, you and Brenda are heading out to, I think it's in a few days, off to Colorado and then down south for a bit of the winter. So thank you for taking time. I know you have a million things you're trying to juggle, and we look forward to staying in touch and launching the Simon Edgar Award early next year, and having a winner that we can introduce at the Edgar Fellows event in August of next year, COVID permitting. So thank you so much for spending so much time with us.
Well, thank you. And thank you for including me in this project. I appreciate it very much.
Great. Thank you. Well, thanks to everyone for watching this special conversation with Governor Edgar. A video of this will be on our YouTube channel tomorrow, so please feel free to view it and pass on all the details of this award to your friends and associates. Thanks so much.